Good morning. My grandmother was the ultimate bargain hunter. She believed in the power of a sales tag. If it was a bargain, she was certain that she could and would put it to good use. She not only cut coupons, she shopped in the correct stores at the correct times to double and triple those coupons' values. She was the pro at extreme couponing before TLC even dreamed up making that a television show. It is no mystery why she was such a bargain hunter. You see, she grew up during the Great Depression, and she told a story about her dad offering her a quarter if she would quit taking sugar in her coffee. She took him up on that because a quarter was a lot of money then. Her frugal nature was something that we often teased her about. I remember one afternoon after spending time cleaning out and organizing her pantry, I walked into her living room and I said, "Grandma, you are no longer allowed to bring salad dressing into this house. I don't care if they give you $1 to take it home. You have to leave it at the store." Because she had more salad dressing in that pantry than she could use in 30 years. My grandmother knew more than just about how to find a bargain. She knew that buying those cake mixes on sale meant that she would have them on hand the next time the church had a fundraiser or a covered dish. She knew that by saving money everywhere she could, it allowed her to be more generous than she could ever imagine. She knew how to look at an item, assess its value, and determine if it was in her budget and worth her expense. She truly knew how to count the cost, and she always did. Today's scripture is about considering the cost. We often talk about salvation as being a free gift, and it is. But there is a cost to discipleship, and we often skip over that part. Jesus did not skip over it. In fact, he is shockingly clear on the issue. There is a cost to being a follower of Jesus, and we need to carefully consider that cost. In today's passage, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He is journeying to the cross. The previous chapters and verses reveal that he has been teaching the crowds. They have gathered around him using parables. But in this passage, he is moving forward. He's traveling towards Jerusalem, and large crowds are traveling with him. But before we go any further, we need to take a look at these large crowds. I have to stop and wonder who they are and what they're about. Because you see, these large crowds were ones that had come to Jesus. They had heard him teach or heard of him, and they came to follow and learn more and see what this is about. Jesus didn't call them out like he did the 12. These came to him because Jesus and his message were gaining traction at this time. So as we look at this crowd traveling toward Jerusalem, I wonder how they saw this experience. Some of them probably looked at this and thought it was a parade. And they were feeding off of the enthusiasm of the crowd and excited to be about something. And so they may have been unaware of any conflict or any costs or even any cross that may need to be bore. Others in that crowd may have seen it as a march. They could envision Jesus setting things right with his authority and power. They were sold on this idea of Jew versus Roman, Jesus versus the establishment, and even peasants versus power. There may have been some other perspectives there as well, but they all seem to miss what Jesus can clearly see. They are blind to what Jesus has already faced, that this is, in fact, a funeral procession. Jesus has this large crowd following him, and they have no idea where they are going or what they are walking into. But Jesus lays it on the line for them. He clearly and succinctly explains the cost of discipleship. What follows are 3 bold statements and 2 parables. So let's begin by looking at this first statement. If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. If I had a list of the top 10 harshest sayings of Jesus, this would be number 1. In fact, last week when I was discussing this with my parents, my mom asked me if I was really getting that quote right. Because hate is such a harsh word. She picked up her phone and Googled it because she didn't trust me to really have that right. This passage is one that we tend to shy away from. We like to go and look at the version in Matthew, which is a little softer, saying that you need to deny your family. Is Jesus really telling us to hate our families? I don't think so. Jesus is too often urging us to love one another for me to think that he is requiring us to actively hate our families. But at the same time, we shouldn't reduce this to simply being Jesus' way of getting the crowd's attention. Jesus didn't need to flick the lights or say, 1, 2, 3, all eyes on me. He just had to speak, and he had their attention. We are in error if we try to soften such a bold statement of Jesus. I believe Jesus is calling us to really evaluate what holds first place in our hearts. Where does our first loyalty lie? It's easy to say that we put Jesus first, that the most important thing in our life is Jesus. But do we really mean it? Do we really prioritize Christ over everything else? I think we want to, but more often than not, I think we fail. If we took time to analyze our schedules, our checkbooks, and our conversations, I think we would be surprised to see where our commitment to Jesus really falls. If our relationship with Jesus is our greatest passion, it would be where we invest our time, our resources, and our attention. I believe that Jesus is telling us to look at our most precious relationships here on earth and realize that our commitment to those should pale by comparison to our commitment to Christ. Think about the different commitments and obligations you have to your spouse, your children, your grandchildren, work, friends, civic organizations, social organizations, even charities. It's easy for our schedule and life to get so full that we neglect to put our relationship with Christ first and foremost. Putting our obedience and devotion to Christ above all else is no easy task, but is the cost of true discipleship. We are even to put our devotion to Christ over our own life. We are so fortunate. We live in a place where we have the freedom to worship Christ. We are safe. In recent weeks, we have been reminded that our brothers and sisters in Christ around the world experience persecution that we cannot really fathom. In other parts of the world, people are actually losing their life because of their commitment to Christ. They are choosing to follow Christ, even if it means their death. Their experience brings fresh perspective to this passage. But Jesus does not stop there. His next statement is just as challenging. And whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. This phrase lands a little softer than the first. It doesn't have quite the same shock factor, but it should. This crowd had a pre-Easter view of the cross. To them, the cross was not a symbol of hope or love. The cross was only horror and humiliation. The cross was punishment for rebellious slaves and people who rebelled against the Roman Empire. It was the most humiliating and painful way to be executed. When this crowd heard Jesus say this, they heard him call them to put their life on the line to follow Christ. When we look at the cross, whether it's in our churches or in our home or a piece of jewelry we wear around our neck, we see hope and love and forgiveness and even a sense of belonging. We as a society have sanitized the cross. We don't see the true horror that these people would have experienced. We look at it and see our reason for hope. We see the cross from a post-Easter view, and it gets in the way of how we read and understand this passage. When we consider what the cross would have meant to the crowd gathered around Jesus, this statement becomes just as challenging as the one before it. But now Jesus shifts gears and begins his parables. Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it? For if you lay the foundation and are not able to finish it, everyone who sees it will ridicule you, saying, "This person began to build and wasn't able to finish." My uncle did that. He counted his costs, that wasn't the issue. But he built a foundation for a house, had the basement walled in, ready to go, and quit building. And it sat there in one of our hayfields unfinished for 15 years. And those of us in the family and community knew that my great-grandmother had passed away and he moved into her home rather than finish this one. But I'm sure there were people driving by going, did they just run out of money? What's going on? Why is this house unfinished? And so that parable kind of struck a note with me because I've seen that happen. But there's another parable that Jesus gives us as well, which is a little harder for me to connect to. Or suppose a king is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 men to oppose the one coming against him with 20,000? If he is not able, he will send a delegation, while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace. Both of these parables are asking us if we are willing to pay the price, if we have considered the expense and what will happen. I have seen enough remodels on HGTV to learn one thing about a house remodel. It will cost more than you think. It always happens that they run into something unexpected, and then they either have to redesign it, give up something they wanted to do, or pay more money. Those are the choices. And I would actually be shocked if I came to the end of any episode and they came in under budget. These homeowners think that they have counted the cost, but often they have to make sacrifices or changes in order to finish their build. Jesus is asking us to consider the cost of following him, to make sure that we are willing to pay the price before we begin that journey. God did not enter into a redemptive process without being prepared to complete it. God considered the cost and was willing to pay the price. Jesus is asking us to do the same. This parable does not just urge us to consider the cost, but also the consequences of not following through. The builder risked humiliation. We risk hurting not just ourselves, but the cause of Christ. Jesus is asking us to carefully consider if the cost of discipleship is more than we are willing or able to pay. How many times have you been to a wedding and you've heard a minister state at the beginning of this that marriage is not to be entered into lightly or unadvisedly, but thoughtfully and reverently and in the fear of God? When we make major commitments, we do so by considering the cost and if we are willing to make the sacrifices that commitment will require. Being a disciple is more than showing up for church on Sunday. Being a disciple is about relationships. It's having a mentor and being a mentor at the same time. It's realizing that for us to move forward, we need people ahead of us showing us the way while remembering to check behind us so that we don't leave others behind. This is what Jesus is calling us to, a way of doing life together where He is at the center of everything we do, but we have each other for encouragement and support along the way. We have to humble ourselves to be discipled, but we also have the responsibility to disciple others. Jesus was not quite finished when explaining the cost of discipleship. He had one more startling statement. In the same way, those of you who do not give up everything you have cannot be my disciples. What is it going to cost to be a disciple of Jesus? Everything. Jesus is not sugarcoating what He's asking for. It will cost you everything you have. There is no fine print with Jesus. This large crowd has now been given the opportunity to weigh the cost and decide if they truly want to follow Jesus and if they are willing to commit to follow Him to the very end. We know that they didn't. That at the very end, even the 12 abandoned Jesus. We look back on the story of Peter, and we can't believe that he denied Jesus 3 times after seeing everything Jesus had done. He got to witness firsthand the miracles of Jesus, and yet he denied Him. But how often do we deny Christ when we have had so much more? We've had the stories of all who bore witness. Christ is asking us to consider the cost of discipleship. Jesus was not asking for a guarantee of complete fidelity in advance. We would all fail at that. Jesus was calling each person to consider what the commitment requires. Rodney Stark is a sociologist, and he studied first century church, paying particular attention to the factors that influenced its survival. In his book, The Rise of Christianity, he has a whole chapter on martyrs. In this chapter, he discusses that while most would think that the risk of martyrdom would hinder the church's growth, it actually did the opposite. According to Stark, because the cost of membership was so high, the people who did join the early church were fully committed, and the church was stronger and more impactful. The risk of martyrdom is what weeded out those who weren't fully committed to the cause of Christ. There's a church that this reminds me of, Cross Ties Ecumenical Church in Waco, Texas. is a small congregation, but they have made a tremendous impact in their community. In 1993, when they had 4 members, they bought a rundown crack house in the Kate Ross neighborhood of Waco, and they began refurbishing it. 3 years later, they opened in that same building that served as their worship center, the Gospel Cafe, which serves 200 meals 3 days a week on a pay-as-you-can basis. Their home base is in one of the most impoverished areas of Waco. They started a youth group, but they were burying more kids than they were graduating. So they took a step back and moved to working with younger kids. They met with the principal of a local elementary school and said, "What could we do to make your incoming kindergartners more successful?" And the principal said that by the time they came to kindergarten, their mental health was so damaged that they could not learn. They had experienced so much trauma. So they met with child psychologists in the area to figure out what to do. And the child psychologist challenged them to do something no one else in Texas was doing, to work with children less than 2 years of age, to try to prevent some of the trauma, to head it off before we got there. Out of this was born the Talitha Institute. The words Talitha come from the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus says to Jairus' daughter, "Little girl, come forth." The Talitha Institute is a therapeutic nursery that has grown over the years to include mentoring for parents. They are dramatically changing their community. They have had children come through that program that have now graduated high school and are going to college. While I was in seminary, I got to meet the pastor of Cross Ties Ecumenical Church. And if you Google the church, you will not find a website or a Facebook page. You may find articles about Talitha or the Gospel Cafe. When I met the pastor back in 2011, the church had 9 members. They had more than doubled their number from when they began in 1988. What was shocking to me about Cross Ties was the commitment level of each member. Cross Ties was a congregation that called for integrity in membership. This means being accountable to one another in small circles called mission groups that make commitments to study and pray, give and serve at a particular point of need. Members take classes in the church's School of Christian Living, as well as join in the community's ongoing life of worship, celebration, and service. Hold on, get ready. Formation for an intern member, not a full member, an intern, might last from 1 to 3 years. Annually, after a period of discernment, members renew or withdraw their covenant membership. Integrity of membership invites members to discern each year whether or not they are still called to this way of journeying with Jesus and his friends. This church asks people to count the cost of journeying with them. They make high demands, but they reap amazing benefits, and their community is impacted by that. This passage reminds us that Jesus was not seeking a huge crowd of people to follow him blindly. He called for a group of committed disciples who had considered the cost and was willing to follow. He knew that the enthusiasm of the crowd would fade, that the emotional high of being caught up in something bigger than yourself was not sustainable. He asked his followers to stop and think, to truly consider the cost. This was a difficult passage to study and prepare. It was easy this past week to get overwhelmed with what Christ was asking us to do. But I want to leave you with something that I found that gave me hope. And it's the words of William Barclay. But if man is daunted by the high demands of Christ, let him remember that he is not left to fulfill them alone. He who has called him to the steep road will walk with him every step of the way and be there at the end to meet him. So prayerfully, I ask you to consider, what is Christ calling you to? Is it a deeper relationship with him through Bible study? Is it looking around and finding someone to disciple you or someone for you to disciple? Is it a new area of service in the church or in the community? The cost is high, but the rewards of following Christ are something that we can only imagine.